Is queer a slur? This is a question I've seen asked a lot recently, or perhaps more accurately, the accusation that it is. Now typically I see this sort of accusation being thrown around by the likes of Ariel Scarcella, so I didn't think to respond to this line of argument. However, there are LGBT+ folk who genuinely take issue with the word, and are not simply doing so to try and exclude trans, bisexual, and other more marginalized identities. Now I know the person I'm responding to is rather controversial, mildly put. However, outside of Turf Central, I couldn't really find anything substantial to respond to that took the same position as Lily, with most other places only laying out both sides and refusing to take a solid stance. And those sorts of rundowns are not where you'll find the best a site has to offer, so my hands were tied in this regard. But for the sake of your human curiosity, I will share my thoughts on Lily towards the end of the video, including why I referenced some of her work in an earlier piece, only to later redact said references. Yet I'll only do that after I responded to each of her arguments, since said character has no impact on the claim she makes. I will also be limiting my usage of the Q word from here on in, using it when discussing identities derived from the label, quoting people or slogans, or I find myself unable to avoid it, so with a list for example. I do this out of respect towards those that disagree with me, to make this video as easy to watch as possible. I use the Q word in the title of and at the start of the video, in order to make this conversation easier to find. Another thing I want to be clear on, and this is mostly for my non-LGBT+ viewers, is the fact that this video is not an excuse to run around throwing the Q word at people who have told you that it makes them uncomfortable. My voice is not a token for you to chip in to whip out the Q word and bash someone over the head with it, claiming that it's okay because I think the term has a general usage. I could be 100% right about the history of the word, and people's reasons for using it in a general sense could be justified without question. That still wouldn't prevent you from being a complete arsehole if you go out of your way to make a marginalized person feel uncomfortable or unsafe. So that laid out plainly, let's continue. I think the best place to start would be with some history on the word, its origins, and who exactly decided to reclaim it. Because even though Lily outright states things like the following,
"But isn't its history as an LGBT term important to consider?" No, Billy, it really isn't. Why not? For the same reason that the crows in Dumbo are looked down on today.
Lily focuses a lot of her time arguing on the very same historical basis, only this time in opposition to the Q word's general usage. She actually leads rather strongly with this, going so far as to compare the Q word to the term degenerate.
The central argument to both of these people is that the Q slur wasn't originally a slur and was originally a term used proudly by the LGBT community back during the era of the Stonewall riots before it was co-opted into a slur by straight people to take power from the LGBT community. Except that's not its actual origin. The Q slur originates from a 16th century German word meaning oblique or perverse, and it finds its roots in the English language as a term to mean strange and odd. It also has a third person usage, which means something that has been ruined. You may actually remember the word's proper usage from The Nightmare Before Christmas of all things.
"What's this? In here, they've got a little tree. How queer! And who would ever think?"
The usage of it to refer to an LGBT person is an informal use, like when people use literally as a form of hyperbole. The word is not a kind word, objectively. It has never been, and it never will be. And the belief that the term originates as an LGBT term is not only wrong, it's a dangerous precedent to set for modern young people who haven't read up on the actual history of language. The Q slur has more in common with the neo-Nazi pejorative degenerate than it does anything else.
Now I had trouble finding where Lily sourced the supposed origin, since the only dictionary I could find with an even vaguely similar listing was the Lexico entry, which reads, quote, "Early 16th century, considered to be from the German word queer, oblique, perverse, but the origin is doubtful," end quote. Funnily enough, this is the origin shown if we Google either queer origin or queer etymology. It's also found in the details if one Googles queer definition, that so long as one clicks the Translations, Word Origin and More Definitions tab, which one needs to do in order to reveal the secondary informal definition relating to homosexuality, like the one Lily shows on screen later in her video. Now I consider that the origin had changed to include the important "but the origin is doubtful" qualifier at the end. Lexico, for those who don't know, is simply the online version of the Oxford English Dictionary, being online meaning it is updated regularly. So to be thorough, I put the call out, and in doing so, I found this dictionary entry to date back as far as 2002, found in the 10th edition of the Concise Oxford English Dictionary, which reads, quote, "Origin, C16, considered to be from German quer, /perverse, but origin is doubtful." End quote. Quick thank you to Zach Marsh for sending that one in. The only other one that had a similar origin entry was from 2008, found in the revised 3rd edition compact Oxford English Dictionary, which read, quote, "Origin, perhaps from German quer, /perverse, end quote. Thanks to the sender who wished to remain anonymous. So certainly a lot less sure on the word's origin in relation to the German word quer than Lily leads her audience to believe. Now in relation to that, I have to consider the work involved as a content creator. Specifically the difference in style between Lily making claims about the word's origin and definition. How one is a screenshot whilst the other isn't, when the two are found in the exact same location. It is very possible that this is all an ugly coincidence, but at the very least it displays the importance of being upfront with your sources when making such an argument, as it really takes the strength out of Lily's. She forwards certainty where there is notable doubt. Something else my digging brought up is the fact that the Q word is also a verb that carries with it 0 negative connotations. A fact shown in the 1993 New Shorter Oxford English Dictionary, submitted to us by Jason Guilford, which reads as, quote, "Queer for, US colloquialism, fond of, keen on, in love with," end quote. So to assert that the word is only associated with negative connotations simply isn't true. Fact is, even if it does come from the German word queer, that does not mean it carries with it negative connotations. Quer durch means to travel. Wir fuhren auf unseren Fahrraden quer durch das Land translates, we rode our bicycles across the country. Quer format means landscape as opposed to portrait in relation to photos or art. The German word quer is very benign, meaning across or diagonal, much like pervert was. Originating in the 14th century, the word referred to the act of setting aside one belief for another, being derived from the Latin per, meaning thoroughly or ill, and vert, meaning to turn. It shares the latter root with many words, such as subvert or invert. By the mid-17th century, the word had become a noun synonymous with apostate. However, it wouldn't be until the late 19th century that the term would come to mean, quote, one who has a perversion of the sexual instinct, end quote, specifically in relation to homosexuality. So from what I understand, the word perversion didn't give homosexuality its negative sexual connotations. It was in fact the other way around. So why am I bringing all this up? How does it relate to Lily's argument here? Well, Lily throws out its possible origin in the 16th century word quer, meaning oblique or perverse, to forward that it has a similar origin to the word degenerate. Yet all of this is weighted on our contemporary understanding of perverse, which only came into existence in the late 19th century. Now you might take the mention of perverse in the origin to be based on our contemporary understanding of the German word quer, but the fact is, I can't find a single modern source that uses the word quer to mean perverse. So how then can the 16th century word quer be based on the 19th century definition of the word perverse? Try to figure that one out. Now yes, the Q word started out with negative connotations and it continued to pick some more up along the way, but the why and the how is important. It was seen as insulting because it meant to veer off from the status quo, to leave the straight and narrow. It was seen as insulting because society was conformist, not cosmopolitan. Differences were a thing to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. The word is used a total of 11 times in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and whilst I can hardly call them positive, none of said use is related to anyone's sexuality or anything sexual for that matter. One usage simply relating to the peculiarity of the Balkan languages. But as things moved on, as society evolved, so too did the word. As noted, it came to be a verb synonymous with love. It also came to mean something eccentric or an oddity, yet not necessarily in a bad way. As seen in the example Lily used, Jack Skellington wasn't declaring Yuletime an abomination. The whole film is about how the festival intrigues him to such an extent that he attempts to steal it for himself. The difference fills him with a sense of wonder. Paris was the word because it was flamboyant. The lights, the sound, the spectacle. Eccentricity, given form. Even when the word came to be associated with homosexuality in the late 19th century, it wasn't popular. As noted, words like pervert along with invert, degenerate and homosexual, which were being pathologized, became the choice language of police and medical practitioners. Outside of these fields, the term fairy was the most common label applied to all LGBT+ people until the Second World War. At least according to Gerson Legman, who published a lexicon of homosexual argot in 1941. The Q word was not really used by either professionals or the general public. The community itself was an entirely different matter. Starting in the 1900s, though really kicking off in the 1930s, the community began to create terms to differentiate the types of gay or bisexual men. Among them were three common ones: fairy, queer, and trade. Fairies were flamboyant, working-class men who embraced their effeminate nature. Queers were middle-class men who lived straight lives during the day and went slumming at night. Trade were working-class sailors or policemen who never questioned their sexuality in spite of seeking out fairies. This is the time period people are referring to when they talk about the terms positive history. Sadly, following the Second World War, we saw an increase in awareness surrounding LGBT+ identities and the language related to it. Over the coming decades, the word was appropriated as just another one of many slurs, joining the ranks of the already well-established slurs, gay and homosexual, gaining connotations of predatory behaviour. By the time both the Compton cafeteria and Stonewall riots occurred, it was part of mainstream language. Yet inside the community, the word flipped. White upper-class cis-gay men with conservative views on LGBT+ liberation used the term as an insult against those who acted outside of heteronormative standards, adopting the word gay to designate themselves as respectable. Or, as George Chauncey put it, quote, "Younger men rejected queer as a pejorative name that others had given them, which highlighted their difference from other men. Even though many queers had also rejected the effeminacy of the fairies, younger men were well aware that, in the eyes of straight men, their queerness hinged on their supposed gender deviance." In the 1930s and 1940s, a series of press campaigns claiming that murderous, sex deviance threatened the nation's women and children gave queerness an even more sinister and undesirable set of connotations. In calling themselves gay, a new generation of men insisted on the right to name themselves, to claim their status as men, and to reject the effeminate styles of the older generation. Some men, especially older ones like Finch, continue to prefer queer to gay, in part because of gay's initial association with the fairies. Younger men found it easier to forget the origins of gay in the campy banter of the very queens whom they wished to reject." End quote. Oh, the fucking irony. Which brings us round to who actually reclaimed the term, which had for decades been a positive, self-claimed label in the community that was later appropriated and abused by cis-het people. Lily's thoughts on this couldn't be clearer, in my mind.
This would, in any sane world, be the exact opposite of a controversial statement, but sadly we don't live in a sane world. We live in a shitty world, where this offensive slur is being pushed by a small number of people as an umbrella term for the entire LGBT community. And the belief that the term originates as an LGBT term is not only wrong, it's a dangerous precedent to set for modern young people who haven't read up on the actual history of language. The Q slur has more in common with the neo-Nazi pejorative degenerate than it does anything else. People love to talk about the LGBT community of the 60s, but what about the people who were beaten and killed by others while having it screamed at them? What about the people who've experienced the harsh truth of being called that slur and are quite frankly disgusted that some idiot kids would have the nerve to just declare that everything's okay now?
So Lily forwards all this as the work of an ignorant group of kids, oblivious or uncaring as to the feelings of people who have suffered the worst humanity has to offer. Not too different to what George Chauncey says. The difference? She's fucking lying. Why was the Q word reclaimed in the 80s? What key event in LGBT plus history occurred around that time? The fucking AIDS crisis, which tore through the LGBT plus community, specifically segments belonging to the working class, ethnic minorities, and trans folk. And it wasn't just the disease. It was the crippling fear campaigns that caused anti-LGBT plus violence to spike. Now, there were largely two responses by the LGBT plus community, one seen in the rich, well-off groups, and another in the more marginalised. Do you want to know how they each responded? The snobs looked down on the poor, the people of colour, the trans folk. They told them that they deserved to die for not assimilating to heteronormative society, for being queer degenerates. And you know how these groups responded? They didn't cower from the word. They adopted it. Said movement gained so much traction on multiple fronts in opposition to the upper-class cis-het gay men that in 1990, we saw the founding of Queer Nation by HIV activists in New York. These were the people who had sat at their friend's side as they wasted away, that had gone down to the station to identify a body so badly beaten that it was hard to tell. They stood proud and told the world those words. Words still spoken to this day. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. They didn't just fight for the right to live, they fought for the right to exist freely. To quote part of an anonymous leaflet handed out at New York Pride in 1990, quote, "Being queer is not about a right to privacy, it is about the freedom to be public, to just be who we are. It means everyday fighting oppression, homophobia, racism, misogyny, the bigotry of religious hypocrites, and our own self-hatred. We have been carefully taught to hate ourselves. And now, of course, it means fighting a virus as well, and all those homo haters who are using AIDS to wipe us off the face of the earth. Being queer means leading a different sort of life. It's not about mainstream, profit margins, patriotism, patriarchy, or being assimilated. It's not about executive directors, privilege, and elitism. It's about being on the margins, defining ourselves. It's about gender, fuck, and secrets. What's beneath the belt and deep inside the heart. It's about the night." End quote. By the way, do go read the rest if you have the time. Thing is, I don't want to be normal. I just want to be me. And so long as I'm not needlessly hurting anyone, why shouldn't I be? But returning to Lily, you have the bloody gall to sit there and invoke their names as an argument against the words reclamation? You judge us for apparently not knowing our history. Well, I say fuck that for a game of soldiers. It is you who has flashed the world with your willful ignorance. All this information was at your fingertips, and yet you chose not to look, or did and chose to lie instead, making segments like these so dreadfully painful to listen to.
The Q slur is unfortunately not afforded the same level of restraint. People treat reclamation as if it's some kind of magical society changer, as if they're the supreme court of language. When people fill my ear about the fact that the Q slur is being reclaimed as a term by the LGBT community, all I can really wonder is when this actually happened, because it seems to be an extremely contentious topic because the word has a harmful and deadly legacy. People love to talk about the LGBT community of the 60s, but what about the people who were beaten and killed by others while having it screamed at them? What about the people who've experienced the harsh truth of being called that slur and are quite frankly disgusted that some idiot kids would have the nerve to just declare that everything's okay now? It's time to come back to what I was talking about earlier. It's not just that people are using it to refer to themselves, that would be a non-issue, but instead there's a big push to use the Q slur as an umbrella term for the LGBT community, regardless of that community's actual feelings on the matter. And speaking as someone in the LGBT community, no. Fuck no. Are you fucking kidding me? No!
The people who decided this was the right thing to do were the majority of LGBT plus people in the 80s and 90s, particularly those who were marginalized in other ways. People who are at least in their late 40s now, if not 50s, 60s, and 70s. Sadly, a large number are no longer with us because, remember, the AIDS crisis was a thing that heavily impacted our community's demographics. That's part of the sad reason older LGBT plus folk often seem to be more conservative, at least proportionally. It's in part because many of the radical leftist ones died out. Now, one thing Lily is playing to here is the idea of silent majority. Lily is forwarding her opposition as a vocal minority that have overshadowed her implied majority. However, at no point in her video does she actually demonstrate any numbers. Now, I did some checking and I couldn't find any peer-reviewed research into the matter. However, there are a number of things to consider. For example, we are at a point where pretty much every official branch of the LGBT plus community accepts the Q word as a reclaimed identity. From research to LGBT plus led charity, it's not seen as an issue. It's always noted that there are some people who still find the term offensive, but said organizations always present that as the minority, suggesting that this is the experience of said groups. Now, there's always the possibility that this is the result of certain groups, say white upper-class gay men, making decisions about said lexicon, but this runs counter to the history of the term and those who led the reclamation effort. As noted, there's no peer-reviewed data on the matter, though I did come across the Queer Experience survey of 2018. Just to be clear, this is a private survey which hasn't published its methodology, let alone been peer-reviewed, though it does report to have a sample size of over 10,000 people. But do keep in mind its limitations. I'm turning towards it in the absence of anything better. Said survey found that, quote, queer was approved by 72.9% of respondents, with 37.2% of respondents specifying queer was their preferred umbrella term, end quote. Building on from this, the study found that, quote, queer was the most widely preferred umbrella term and the third most approved of umbrella terms, behind LGBT+ and LGBTQ+, end quote. What's more is the survey shed light on the demographics behind who accepts or preferred the term. Quote, groups that do not prefer the use of queer as an umbrella are straight respondents, exclusionist identifying respondents, transmedicalist, true scum, sex-negative respondents, and sex work critical respondents. Queer as an umbrella was preferred above umbrella terms by all gender identities and by all orientation groups other than straight, end quote. Which brings us round to this lovely clip.
But if you insist on using it to describe others, using it as an umbrella term, calling LGBT characters queer characters, or using stupid fucking terms like queer studies, or start calling people who don't want to be associated with a slur nasty names and start making up nonsense about it being a turf dog whistle, then you can go eat 1,000 prickly dicks right in the ninth circle of hell where you fucking belong, you jackass.
Or you could sit your self-righteous ass down, acknowledge the facts that every step of the way it's been conservatives, assimilationists, and exclusionists who have most strongly rejected the Q word, and see how your words feed into the wider context and even go so far as to harm those of us who don't want to be forced into denying our true selves. It is a demonstrable fact that terse like Ariel Scarcella and true scum like Buck Angel fucking love to target the Q word to flex their assimilationist muscles in opposition to the supposed trans trenders. If you find yourself uncomfortable with the fact that these are among the only people who vocally support the same position as you, perhaps consider why that is. But since we're here now, how about we talk about why bigots are so desperate to sink the Q word? You actually touched on it when discussing the LGBT+ acronym.
But it does something that no other umbrella term has ever bothered to do. It's inclusive. It's a mess, but like any acronym, it can be adjusted.
Yes, it can be adjusted. And as seen with the drop the T, that is one of the ways bigots would very much like to adjust it. Followed shortly after by the B. Hell, many who argue to drop the T can't even wait till that's done to start abusing bisexual people. Groups like the LGBT Alliance and Graham Linehan have both started targeting them as well. And this is not something new, by the way. Following the Stonewall riots, at the early Christopher Street Liberation Day rallies, transphobic pundits were given a platform whilst no trans person was. What were their demands? Exclude the trans community from the then repackaged gay liberation movement. The reason? Well, they argue that society, whilst maybe willing to accept assimilationist gay and lesbians, would never accept trans people since they were too deviant, too much of the Q word. That's why Sylvia Rivera, a Latina trans woman, was forced to climb on stage and call this out, pointing out how the early Christopher Street Liberation Day rally had been hijacked by a white, upper-class exclusionist group.
I will not no longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that. If you all want to know about the people that are in jail, and do not forget Bambi Lamore and Dora Marks, Kenny Messner, and other gay people that are in jail, come and see the people at Starhouse on 12th Street, on 640 East 12th Street, between B and C, apartment 14. The people that are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle class, white club, and that's what you all belong to. Revolution now! Give me a G! Give me an A! Give me a Y! Give me a P! Give me an O! Give me a W! Give me an E! Give me an R! Gay power! Louder gay power!
Now, one of those people was Fred Sargent, a self-labeled Stonewall veteran / retired police lieutenant who is rolled out by transphobes anytime someone acknowledges the history surrounding the riots. He was partner to Craig Wadwell, the owner of the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop found along the same street as the Stonewall Inn, Christopher Street. Neither Fred nor Craig were patrons of Stonewall. You see, Stonewall didn't really cater to the middle or upper class LGBT+ people who had other establishments they could go to. Stonewall was one of the few places that served the dregs of the community, so people of colour, trans people, and the poor. The unhealthy social atmosphere, as Fred and Craig would later put it. It was known to be mob run, as were all the gay bars including Julius, the bar Fred and Craig attended instead of Stonewall, but other people didn't have the same choice in where they could go. So without Stonewall, many of these people would have been socially starved, so they tolerated the problems for the time being. Craig and Fred, middle-class shop owners on the same street, had different ideas.
Craig and I had different experiences with the Stonewall. Craig had worked with Mattachine on a number of alcohol-related issues having to do with the city government. where I had come into the Stonewall when I first started coming down to New York. I had walked in one afternoon, not in the evening, but just on an afternoon, and I didn't know it at the time, but the bar had only been open a couple of months, and when I walked in there, I thought, well, this place is a dump. It looked pretty worn out when I got there. So it wasn't the type of place that I felt comfortable in. And I didn't go back until one time he and I went in just to see what was going on there. Craig knew somebody who worked in the bar, and we had heard various stories about some of the things that were happening. And Craig had been campaigning against the bar at various times, and pretty much what we had heard was confirmed by that one visit.
Did you catch that? The man who was later lauded as leading the Stonewall movement had attempted to get the place shut down, the only place many LGBT+ folk had to go. Though after seeing the momentum the riots gained, Craig and Fred inserted themselves into the narrative as heroes, in spite of the fact that they were trying to pressure government officials to crack down on the establishment. No care for the safety of the people they'd be forcing to pick between having nowhere to go or an increased risk of police raids. To this day, Fred maintains that trans women of colour didn't exist at the Stonewall Inn, that in spite of the fact that the police were hunting trans people and not gay people, as noted in the way that the people inside were divided into male and female, strip searched and then arrested if their gender presentation didn't match their genitalia. Apparently, there were no trans people at the Stonewall Inn. When people refused to be sexually assaulted by police, they arrested the lot and dragged them outside, which sparked the rioting. We also have testimony by people such as Miss Major Griffin Gracie, a regular patron and black trans woman still alive to this day. And she described her experience as a regular at Stonewall, quote, "Stonewall provided us trans women with a nice place for social connection," Griffin Gracie said. "Then only some gay bars let us in. Others would chase us out. We could go to Stonewall and everything would be fine. We didn't have to explain ourselves." End quote. By the way, Miss Major was inside the inn at the time it was raided, fought back and was knocked unconscious by police. But she's a trans woman of colour. He's a well-spoken, middle-class, gay/former police lieutenant. Therefore, his admittedly shady as fuck word as a non-patron is taken to be gospel by transphobes who wish to erase trans people from their history. So you can't claim my concerns with the current system are unfounded, as I have ample historical and contemporary backing. Indeed, it seems that much of the hostility towards the Q word is founded on the fact that it's inherently inclusive and cannot be treated like the acronym in that it cannot be revised to kick out a certain group. It's an all or nothing sort of deal. It doesn't replace any of the individual identities, though it does unite them in an important way. It differentiates to celebrate, not segregate. It turns a spread hand into a solid fist, and that is power. Queer power. Now we also see that what you said at the start isn't what you're actually wanting here. You take problem with those of us who do use the term, referring to fictional characters by it, which hits on something important. Representation matters. Seeing ourselves in the media matters. So for you to come along and declare that we can't refer to characters like us via our own terms carries with it implications. It teaches us that we should be ashamed of who we are and by extension, what the Q word signifies in us, which is our difference. You may not have given this much thought or intended it that way, but that's the message that makes it through. This is even though, again, you have no basis for your argument. The term was adopted in a positive manner before it later became appropriated by cishet society as an insult, linking the community to sexual predators. We then took it back. Now maybe you disagree. Maybe you think at that point it was a lost cause. Yet if so, I have to ask you this. What do you intend to do about the current trans panic? If I'm not being clear, I'm referring to the ongoing smear campaign against the entire trans community, which is painting us all as predators, seeking to break into women's bathrooms and toilet stalls, to rape little girls. The very same style of campaign that led the Q word to becoming a slur. Should we just roll over and accept it, dropping the T word? Or are we permitted to fight this, Your Highness? Because if you're consistent in your position, you will pick the former. Fact is, it's worse than that in the way that there is a term in the community that did mean sexual deviant prior to being associated with homosexuality, and yet I don't see you giving a shit about that one. The word? Gay. Starting in the 12th century, just like the Q word, this term meant odd or flamboyant. Then sometime between the 14th and 17th century, the word picked up connotations of sexual immorality. It became associated with womanizing men, female sex workers, and brothels. And while sometimes it referred to members of the LGBT+ community as an extension of this perceived sexual immorality, this only became its primary association in the mid-20th century. And I don't know if it's a British thing, but I remember gay being used as an insult at school. I can't say I ever recall the Q word being used the same way. There's a reason the UK charity Stonewall started with their That's So Gay campaign in schools, only branching out to include other identities further down the line. Yet in spite of this, you only seem to have a problem with the Q word in this regard, even though its history is nothing like you pretend, your rendition being a closer match for the historical etymology of the word gay. And yes, that does piss me off. The double standards on display here in regards to your selective outrage are amazing. So I've hopefully set the record straight on the origins of the Q word, when it was first adopted by the community, how it later became appropriated and turned into a slur, and who then reclaimed it. However, this was not Lily's only argument. Another is the way she presents the LGBT+ acronym as being superior to the Q word in a number of ways.
Putting aside the fact that this is, as I've established, a derogatory term meant to describe something as a strange other and has a violent and hateful legacy attached to it, the LGBT community already has an umbrella term, LGBTQIA+. This term, while indeed murder on the vocal cord, serves the job of an umbrella term much better by clearly conveying everything it's meant to convey: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, intersex, asexual / aromantic, and everything else. The everything else at this point being pansexual and non-binary people. LGBTQIA+, or the acronym as it's come to be known, isn't perfect. Not only is it awkward to say, leading many to shorten it to just LGBT, it's a mess of redundancies and strange decisions, like questioning getting its own letter while pansexual and non-binary people are shunted into the plus. Those should be flipped around, or perhaps just take out the stupid plus and add the P in the end. But it does something that no other umbrella term has ever bothered to do. It's inclusive. It's a mess, but like any acronym, it can be adjusted. Queer, on the other hand, is an obfuscating term. It strips out the nuance of non-straight identities and waters them down into an amorphous gray sludge. And when you're trying to apply that to everybody, well, imagine taking the vast array of pride flags and replacing them all with a single brown square. That's what queer does to people's identities. And that's not helpful because everyone experiences oppression differently. Bisexual people can get shit from gay people and called deceitful. Trans people get shit from both of them and called mentally ill. Asexual people get shit from literally fucking everybody for no good reason whatsoever. Non-binary people are still being expected to prove they exist, with both TERFs and True Scum constantly giving them shit, again for no good reason whatsoever. And now we're grinding just a little more shit into everyone's eyes by expecting them to adopt a new identity that is explicitly designed to obfuscate things and reduce people's identities down to a vague, meaningless non-word. Nobody is ever helped by being covered with a sheet, and I say no. I thoroughly reject the notion that this term should be adopted as an umbrella term for an extremely diverse set of people with vastly different experiences, needs, and concerns. We have enough problems to deal with when the government tries to erase our identities. We don't need to be erasing each other's identities as well. Apply it to yourself if you feel so inclined, but if you insist on using it to describe others, using it as an umbrella term, calling LGBT characters queer characters, or using stupid fucking terms like queer studies, or start calling people who don't want to be associated with a slur nasty names and start making up nonsense about it being a TERF dog whistle, then you can go eat 1,000 prickly dicks right in the 9th circle of hell where you fucking belong, you jackass.
Except adopting the Q word as an umbrella term in no way erases other identity-specific terms or flags. It doesn't obscure or limit anything. It merely offers greater choice in the matter. Do note, non-binary folk are included in the typical acronym, right there, under trans, which is why the flag contains a white line in the middle. That's also why I'm made rather uncomfortable by flags that replace this midsection rather than one of the two pink or blue stripes. However, trans being an umbrella term doesn't stop people like me from making additional terms to convey the nuance of our identities. It doesn't turn all trans identities into an amorphous brown square. It doesn't erase our existence. So why would the Q word? If you want to see this in practice, just look at the community in India. The Q word here never went through appropriation like it did in the West. As a result, the question of whether it's a slur doesn't even register. So much that we don't have Delhi Pride, we have Delhi Queer Pride. Delhi's first LGBT plus cafe is the Q Cafe. And whilst they do have acronyms here, they typically lack the plus, being LGBT or LGBTQ, since due to the usage of the Q word, they never had a need for it. And even then, said terms are more clinical language. And from talking to people here, I found the Q word to be the de facto umbrella term. And yet, in spite of the Q word being the go-to umbrella, we don't see the problems Lily is harping on about. They have all the terms listed in the acronym and more here. Lily's fears hold as much weight upon looking at real-life examples as the fear surrounding trans-inclusive bathrooms, which raises concern. Namely, the way in which Lily ends her video by verbally abusing queer people who refuse to get in the cage she has for them sets a precedent, and that precedent can have harmful results. It can stoke the fires of racism and even fascism in presenting any general usage of the Q word as a slur, whilst entire countries view it as perfectly acceptable. Ignoring for a moment the fact that the majority of LGBT plus people in the West agree it's not a slur, if Lily's mindset was to become the default, that could very easily create tension online between communities from different countries, resulting in LGBT plus people from places like India feeling even more excluded from certain circles. It'd also be very easy for rainbow fascism to prey on this the same way they do everything else. And you might think that hyperbolic, but the fact is UK TERF groups have direct links to fascist groups. So this is a genuine concern I have. Returning to the acronym, we of course have the facts that LGBTQIA+ was less approved of than the Q word in the survey discussed earlier, with LGBTQ+ and LGBT+ being the only acronyms with higher approval. And yet the Q word still had the highest level of preference across every demographic other than straight. However, there are also a number of other problems with the acronym, not to forget standalone reasons to prefer the Q word as an umbrella term. I managed to come up with 5 distinct ones. Reason 1. Person Q rejects the belief that LGBT plus people need to assimilate to cishet notions of normality, as has come to dominate LGBT plus discourse. Reason 2. Person Q wishes to honor those who died of HIV during the AIDS crisis or were targets of violence because of it. Reason 3. Person Q views the LGBT plus community, as is, including the acronym, to be hierarchical. Reason 4. Person Q views the LGBT plus community and the acronym to be a product of Western colonial taxonomy. Reason 5. Person Q wishes to disarm an active slur for future generations. A reason that only grows stronger the more you argue it is a slur. Fact is, I also have 2, arguably 3 personal reasons an individual may adopt the term, though I think I'll save them to discuss in further detail in a future video. Now, if you came here having only watched Lily's video on the matter, you likely hadn't heard or thought about any of these, and there's a good reason for that. When presenting her opposition's arguments, this is how Lily did so.
At the conclusion of Steven Universe's Garbage and Here's Why, I made this remark about the LGBT spectrum. This is applicable toward, well, really anybody who falls under the LGBT spectrum. Is it a spectrum? I'm gonna say it is, because this doesn't fit in a spoken dialogue very well, and this is a slur, and fuck that noise. This would, in any sane world, be the exact opposite of a controversial statement, but sadly we don't live in a sane world. We live in a shitty world, where this offensive slur is being pushed by a small number of people as an umbrella term for the entire LGBT community. This attitude is fucking gross, and here's why. The usage of the Q slur as an identifier is the subject of a lot of debate, usually centered around the term's origin and whether it's appropriate to use the term or not. Unfortunately, the debate itself splits into 2 separate camps, only one of which I hold a strong and passionate objection to. The first camp are people who choose to use the Q slur as a self-identifier because I don't really know why. Everyone seems to have different reasons for using it, but the general gist of it is that the dozens of other terms are not good enough for one reason or another. The other camp are the advocates for the adoption of the Q slur as an umbrella term for the entire LGBT community, arguing that the large and diverse pool of terminology is too specific, and we need to make everything more broad and all-encompassing. We can talk about those fucking jackasses in a moment. The central argument to both of these people is that the Q slur wasn't originally a slur and was originally a term used proudly by the LGBT community back during the era of the Stonewall riots before it was co-opted into a slur by straight people to take power from the LGBT community.
The position that Lily forwards, that there are people who are, quote, arguing that the large and diverse pool of terminology is too specific and we need to make everything more broad and all-encompassing, end quote, doesn't exist. It is a flat-out fabrication, an invention of her making. Nobody is making that argument since that's not how words work. Just as trans being an umbrella term for all non-cisgender people doesn't erase the existence of non-binary, gender-fluid or genderqueer identities, neither does the Q word. Funnily enough, the genderqueer flag can be seen in the collection Lily shows on screen before declaring that acceptance of the Q word would erase that identities when no, the exact opposite is true. It has in fact given LGBT plus folk another term to work with, to explore, yet this is how she presents her opposition. On top of this, the Q in LGBTQIA+, Lily shows on screen, doesn't represent questioning. It represents queer pride. Because whilst the Q can be either, the flag the Q is made from in this image is the queer pride flag shown in the upper left corner. So well done on failing to do your research, Lily. The point is, this is nothing more than a straw man, a facile presentation of the position Lily is pretending to refute, meaning she in no way has to tackle the many highly valid reasons behind adopting the Q word in place of the acronym. In this, we come to the sad conclusion that Lily's video is less about arguing her case in light of what her perceived opponent has actually said, and more about posturing and showpersonship. And this is not the only time Lily resorts to such methods. Take for example this clip detailing why she believes the term's history is irrelevant to its reclamation.
But isn't its history as an LGBT term important to consider? No, Billy, it really isn't. Why not? For the same reason that the crows in Dumbo are looked down on today. Even if we accepted the premise that the Q slur was originally a point of LGBT pride with no other history behind it, that wouldn't be the win card so many people think it is, because guess what else was a point of pride for LGBT people?
I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
Rocky Horror Picture Show was a fucking galling film released in 1975 that took every trans-misogynistic trope possible, rolled them into a single character that then rapes two people and grooms another to be a sex slave, and somehow, beyond all reason, this has become a huge piece of LGBT culture, applauded and almost never spoken out against. Very rarely does someone speak out against it, at which point a lot of other LGBT people will dogpile on those people for daring to question a shitty portion of LGBT culture as if we're somehow exempt from the same levels of basic human decency that other people are. Problems like this are all over the LGBT community, with properties and people who would be considered brazenly offensive and gross in any other demographic held up and applauded as icons. Rocky Horror Picture Show is just the most notable example on a very long list of extremely problematic faves. The existence of TERFs and true scum also indicate that LGBT people are more than capable of being garbage humans, especially to each other, so the completely myopic view of these things is almost expected. Rocky Horror is considered a big part of gay culture, and so the fact that it's almost a minstrel show depiction of trans people isn't important to a lot of its fans because, not my problem. So while people might like to make the claim that LGBT people in the 60s used to call themselves the Q slur, this isn't exactly winning the argument, because all you're telling me is that the gay community of the 60s was extremely problematic.
So laying my cards out here, I fucking hate the Rocky Horror Picture Show. My dissertation was on trans representation in film and looked at, among many other things, Ace Ventura, Zoolander, The Danish Girl, and the aforementioned Rocky Horror Picture Show, complete with sections on how the rape scenes helped lay the groundwork for the current trans panic. What I don't remember discussing, however, was how the film was written and directed by trans people. Just like I don't remember how many black people were in key positions in the production of Dumbo. Same for Thai people and the Siamese cat from the Aristocats that you show later. Now if they had, it still wouldn't necessarily mean that these depictions were okay. but it'd be a conversation to be had. Fact is, these depictions are largely rejected by the communities they claim to represent, whilst the Q word is overwhelmingly seen as reclaimed and is the most popular umbrella term from what little data we do have. So to even pretend that the examples you throw out here are on the same level as the Q word is inherently dishonest. And this problem continues.
Guys, guess what? One of the N-words appears in Martin Luther King's letter to Birmingham jail. That doesn't mean you should start running out and calling people that. If this letter was written today, the word would not fucking be there, because we've long since realized that it never should have been used in the first fucking place, because that's how the evolution of cultural enlightenment actually works. It was always unacceptable, and the fact that our parents did it anyway is a bad mark on them. But hasn't the Q slur been reclaimed? Like the other N-word was? Billy, that's not the same thing. Why? Because nobody is actually dumb enough to try and use the N-word in a civilized conversation. An uncommon but persistent defense of the adoption of the Q slur is to draw comparison to the reclamation of the N-word by black people, but reclamation and adoption are two very different things. Despite the long-standing reputation that black people can use the N-word and white people can't, in reality, nobody can really use it because it's still recognized as a slur. It doesn't matter what color your skin is, if you use it, you're still gonna get funny looks, you're still gonna be asked to leave public places, you're still gonna be treated about the same way as if you publicly uttered any other vulgarity, and you're still gonna be laughed at if you're pathetic enough to complain about that. You wouldn't stand up and scream fuck in the middle of a restaurant, and the same rule applies there. Nobody pushes for the adoption of the N-word. Nobody tries to rebrand people of color as the N-word community. Nobody gets bitchy if someone else doesn't want the word uttered in their presence. While someone may use it to refer to themselves, they would never be so stupid as to use it to refer to another. It is an antagonistic word and is treated as such.
You're right, the majority of black people don't use the term in a general manner, though there are times where it could be seen as appropriate to say, for example, slam poetry on ethnic identity. However, just as with the earlier examples, you hit a snag. Just because some words can be chosen to be reclaimed does not suddenly mean that all words will, should, or can. And that last part is very important. How can something be reclaimed as a source of pride if it never was? On that grounds, I'd like to ask Lily, when exactly did black people come up with the N-slur used in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail? They didn't. It was created by European colonialists. You can't reclaim what you never had, only appropriate. And on that basis, I agree with Lily. It is a shitty comparison, which is why we shouldn't make it and should instead focus on comparing the Q word to reclaimed slurs like gay. Yet even then it's not perfect, since gay, unlike the Q word, actually had negative sexual connotations prior to its association with homosexuality. But hey, if a comparison was one-to-one, it'd be the same case. So in light of that, I think the reclamation of the word gay is about as close as we're ever going to get. So in conclusion, it's pretty clear that Lily lacks any and all basis here. She can't actually tackle the arguments made in favour of adopting the Q word as an umbrella term, instead resorting to knocking down poorly fabricated straw men. She also ignores the fact that this debate is long over. It was over decades ago. The vast majority of LGBT+ people see the Q word as acceptable, and it is the preferred umbrella term across the board. There's also a massive hypocrisy in the way Lily conducts herself. At one point she demands to know who assigned themselves the supreme court of language.
People treat reclamation as if it's some kind of magical society changer, as if they're the supreme court of language.
And yet, that's all Lily has done here herself, in spite of the fact that the majority of LGBT+ people view the term to be reclaimed, in spite of the fact that entire countries use it as an umbrella and we see none of the problems she harps on about, in spite of the fact that she's incredibly ignorant about the history and etymology of the word itself. Lily declares that irrelevant because it's her opinion that the word is wrong, and her opinion must be right for no other reason than it is just that. And it's just so obvious once you actually sit down and think about what's being said. So what does this all mean for those of you viewing? Ultimately, do what you were doing. Freely use the Q word to refer to yourself, the community, characters, theory, whatever. It is a reclaimed label. If someone says it makes them uncomfortable, refrain from referring to them by it. Otherwise, It's your word. Explore yourself with it. But do know, you don't have to stick to one. I, for example, use LGBT+ in more academic settings and the Q word in more informal settings. It's just one of those things I've done over time. The point is, nobody is holding a gun to your head and forcing you to use the Q word. It's an option, an addition, a choice. Have fun exploring yourself with it. So with that out of the way, I think I've actually covered all major points from Lily's video on the matter. There's only one thing I wanted to point out, and it's my issue with this segment.
This would, in any sane world, be the exact opposite of a controversial statement, but sadly we don't live in a sane world. We live in a shitty world, where this offensive slur is being pushed by a small number of people as an umbrella term for the entire LGBT community.
Can we just revel in the hypocrisy here? The way Lily is throwing her weight around over the fact that the vast majority of LGBT+ people view the Q word to be reclaimed, and that it is in fact the most popular umbrella term as a problem since it glorifies what, in her mind, is a slur. All whilst Lily is resorting to simple ableism, throwing around that anyone who disagrees with her on this has mental health problems, and that people with said problems are shitty. Again, selective outrage seems to be the order of the day. Another thing I noticed whilst recording this video is that in spite of the fact that Lily dislikes Natalie, aka ContraPoints, her "this is the result of young uppity people who are ignorant of their history" is only a stone's toss away from "I'm one of the last old school transers." This is even though they're both, late 20s, early 30s, a few years older than me? This patronization is slightly irksome, not to mention just incredibly funny in how two people who absolutely hate each other are making the same sort of baseless statements. Now, I promised I'd share my thoughts on Lily once I dispatched of her arguments, so I guess that's all I have left to do. When I first came across Lily, I had a lot of respect for her. She's fucking wrong on some of the things she talks about, but I still had respect. The way she didn't needlessly sugarcoat everything in the sickeningly bad faith manner so many shitsticks on this hell site do was refreshing. In short, I take no issue with how she presents herself. What I do take issue with is her manipulative behaviour in the background. I referenced her work in one of my videos last year, though just to be clear, I'd already started to work on this video by then. However, what was brought to my attention was a lot of abusive shit involving former partners, fans, just a whole clusterfuck. It really was a mess, and it seemed like everyone had done something that nobody was in the right. I could have tried to piece everything together, but the fact is, I had my hands full, so I just noted this, hit unsubscribe, and stopped watching. However, more recently, I've been notified that Lily is partaking in rape culture, specifically relating to Tara Reid, one of the many women who has come out and credibly accused Joe Biden of sexual harassment, as well as one instance of sexual assault, an event corroborated by multiple people who she confided in at the time. However, according to Lily, Tara Reid's story has changed and is therefore not trustworthy. The problem? Tara Reid's story has never changed. She supplied additional details about the full extent of what happened as time has moved on. A common thing for victims of assault. I myself went through a similar process after 2011, where I was forced to address the facts that yes, I was abused and then sexually assaulted as a child. I was out about having ended up in a refuge by at least 2013. I was out about the fact that I'd been sexually assaulted inside that refuge by May of 2018. Yet it wasn't until October of 2018 that I finally told the whole story of how my abuser got me to do things to my brother under the pretense of playing a game. This was for things that happened around the turn of the millennium. It took me 18 years to finally get my whole story out, and I'm someone who has worked in mental health backgrounds, who had all the resources and support right there. And just to be clear, the article Lily links bases its bullshit on an equally weaselly article in the New York Times. The article, which originally stated that, quote, "No other allegation about sexual assault surfaced in the course of reporting, nor did any former Biden staff members corroborate any details of Ms. Reid's allegation. The Times found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Mr. Biden, beyond the hugs, kisses and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable. End quote. Now I say originally because after this was published and quoted in the tweet put out, people were quick to point out that the items listed were sexual harassment and therefore sexual misconduct, which provoked the Biden campaign to call up the New York Times and redact it. They removed the follow-up statement for reporting on the facts of their findings because it completely contradicted what they said. That's who the people Lily turns to back her claims are in turn sourcing their conclusion from. People who went back and edited an article that vindicated Reed in every way. Beyond that, the only changes in Reed's story are, as mentioned, her supplying more details over time, as is expected. If you disagree, tell me one tangible difference. Note, difference, not addition, that has one key detail about the case contradicting another. So yeah, I don't hold much, if any, respect for Lily by this point. However, as noted at the start, none of this really had any relevance to our arguments throughout this video, hence they weren't discussed in relation to them. I just wanted to make my thoughts known after all that, since people keep asking me. Now, if you appreciate what myself and Adita do here on the channel in fighting back against misinformation, do know that you can support us via Patreon. Your support gives us the funds to keep going and keep putting out videos involving this level of research. You can also check out our other videos to see more of what we have to offer. So with that said, we'd just like to thank all our Patreon sponsors, giving special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Soraya and Katie, Garrett Van Vorst, Chelsea Williams, Doyle Jackson, Wellington Marcus, Sosh Daniels, Justin Allen, and Atlas5. And for myself and Adita, take care now.